All right, welcome to UTOKing. He's our most popular guest, folks. He's been on the show more than anybody else. It's a certain Layman Pascal, and he is here to talk about a wide variety of things, of course. But Gurdjieff, For a Time Between Worlds, is a book, hyper-personal essays on the grandfather of metamodern spirituality. Hey, friend. Woohoo! Welcome. Good to see you.
Good to see you. Nice to be back.
Yeah,
I'm the most frequent guest. I don't know if I'm the most popular guest, but let's blur that line.
We can blur the line, right? We can have fun with language, you know? Most popular me. There you go. So we'll be chatting about that and a wide variety of other things. But first and foremost, good to see you. Good to have you here.
No, good to see you, too. And I think you're a great interlocutor around some of the Gurdjieff ideas because, one of the things the book is doing is trying to introduce this guy to developmental, transformational, regenerative networks and all the kind of coherent pluralist cultural move we're involved in.
Totally.
But another thing it's trying to do is figure out new ways to think about, new ways to language, new ways to appreciate, what's in that tradition and what's in this peculiar spiritual character. And the UTOK framing gives us some new ideas and some new tools to do that. Like if we start using your mind 1A, 1B, 3A, what does Gurdjieff's system look like in that kind of framing? There's a lot of interesting things that we could unpack there, as well as your recent interest in consciousness. I think that ties in with some of his interests really well.
That's totally. So here's so I really enjoyed the book. It was fascinating. It's fascinating to feel your angle on him. And it's really fascinating to look back on my own evolution and development from essentially a modernist with some postmodern sensibilities into a full-fledged metamodernist. Because I would have normally read Gurdjieff, say, in 2004, right before Tree of Knowledge as my psychological science. And like, what the fuck is this guy? This guy's all over the place. I can't get a handle on it. But the way you framed it and gave, and I hadn't even heard of him until, I don't know, maybe 5 years ago or whatever. That shows my level of ignorance. But the way in which he's approaching thinking about where we are is super. I love the way you framed him as a sort of a metamodern, early metamodern guide, because he's pulling from so many different elements, giving us an opportunity to think. And I can totally see why you would relate to him, because he's this really rich, fascinating, complex character that pulls. So maybe you can tell a little bit about how you came across him and a little bit about the inspiration. I'll make a comment. We are publishing brothers here in the sense that this was published by Sky Meadow Press. I think it's the first book, right, that Brendan Sky Meadow Press put out. So we make a plug to him in Metamodern Spirituality. And UTOK is coming out October 2nd. Hopefully it will be the actual day that we're going to release that thing. And that's out of the same press. So we're joined together in terms of authorship in that way as in so many other ways. But I just want to make that point. So let's back up. Tell me a little bit about your rendezvous with this super fascinating character,
all right.
Gurdjieff.
He's a guy who's been part of my psychological life since I was an early teenager.
Okay.
I'd read about him in the two Wilsons. So in the United States in the 70s, there was Robert Anton Wilson, and in Britain there was Colin Wilson. And they both were leading edge philosophical, literary artists and trying to pick up all the pieces of the interesting 20th century revolutions that have been going on. And they both were really interested in this guy. So I was aware of him as one of these early 20th century characters.
Right.
I didn't pay too much attention to it. But when I got a little older, so 15, 16, I ran into P.D. Uspensky, the Russian mathematician who was really interested in development and building a kind of almost Wilberian super theory and trying to bring Nietzsche into that. And I'm like, well, anybody who's got a developmental integrative cosmology and also loves Nietzsche and the fourth dimension, which I was super into at the time, is probably somebody I should read. So I start really going through Uspensky. And then it turns out Uspensky was probably the most famous pupil of this guy that I'd heard about when I was younger.
Right.
So I started to read about their relationship, and you got to start kind of teasing apart Uspensky's influence on the lineage from Gurdjieff's influence and the depth of character and the type of person that they are really starts to stand out when you tease them apart. But the more you dive into this guy, and for me personally, the more you read his actual books or also deal with people who are in the practicing lineages, the more you get an impression that's very different than the one that you might find on Wikipedia.
Right.
Right? There's this
Okay.
sort of notion that this is a hard way where humans are machines and only a
Mm.
few of us can wake up. And
Hmm.
that's not untrue, but the emphases are a little bit wrong there because this is a very rich, very human, very adventurous, very funny, very creative, avant-garde guy who's pulling together all kinds of spiritual streams to create, in the early 20th century, like up to the 20s and 30s, a stacked developmental model of existential development within an imaginal cosmos that places our development in an ecological context, tries to take seriously the challenges that modernity puts on that, but
Yep.
also has a critique of modernity and a critique of the critiques of modernity. And that's a really sweet spot because as the metamodern and or whatever we want to call it movement tries to articulate itself into the world,
Right.
it's got to have deep inner practice. It's got to have the possibility of civilization change. It's got to have a flavor of its own, but it's also got to have ancestors of some kind. We've got to look for people that lead into this so that we're part of some kind of lineage, even if that's mostly an imaginal lineage. And I think this guy's a really good candidate for a grandfather of metamodern spirituality, somebody who's standing just before us and really did serious work on himself and serious work to try to understand the multifarious sets of perspectives and traditions and aspects of human psychology, because he's a very interesting psychologist. There's not a lot of people in the early 20th century talking this way. And you find a little bit of the plurality of the psyche and the psychosynthesis models and things like that, but he's got a strong pluralist psyche. He's got a strong evolutionary stack. He's got a strong, sincere, ironic disposition. So there's a lot of elements for us to really cherish and dig into that we can all relate to now as we're trying to do this cultural move ourselves.
This is beautiful. Yeah, that's what. But that's a wonderful articulation of my sense as I got through the multiplicity of different essays. So the book is basically a series, like you said, of hyper personal essays, and the number of different angles and flavors and layers to Gurdjieff, and your metabolization and sharing him was really impressive and perfect then for sort of the multiplicity of an age that's also recursively self-aware. And so that's what, and so let's talk a little bit. If I go to Wiki and check out Gurdjieff, he's like, well, most people aren't really very conscious. And he said that there's a body and an emotional system and the mind. And then there's this fourth way, and he's trying to wake everybody up. How about we start sort of there if people have heard that sort of brief Wiki, and then see if we can get to your rich description, and then we'll tie it back into Utah, because mind 1, 2, 3 is going to lay, and I'm pointing to mind 4 and all this other stuff. And so I think those would be wonderful intersections for us.
Yeah. All right, let me start with these 4 ways, and then move into a little bit about how he sees the internal composition of the human being. So one of his sort of intellectual artifacts that he leaves behind is this notion of these 4 ways, which is basically 3 plus 1, because he's saying we're all composed of multiple subjective internal intelligence systems. And you could simplify that by just talking about the 3 dominant ones in human beings, which is something like the intellect, something like the emotional, and something like the sensory neuromuscular system.
Yep.
And everybody's a little bit imbalanced in these, right? You have a born disposition and you have an acquired disposition that you grow up with. So if you were going to seek out some kind of transformation system, if you were going to turn to spirituality or existential change or something like that, you probably seek out something more or less unconsciously that corresponds to your dominant function. So if your dominant function is mental, you start reading the ancient texts. You get really interested in witnessing the arising of the self and how can I constrain my attention. You're doing all these intellectual exercises. If you're more of an emotional person, maybe you find somebody who just wants to help you love. Right? Love God, love your master, open your heart, constantly supersede incoherent emotions with coherent motions. Or if you're a more physical person, there are yogic and fakir-like practices where basically, and we don't see a lot of this in the West, but in India, there's a ton of people who just try to transcend their physical body as their primary method of self-change. So you've got these systems. Then there's this idea that there's this other one. It's a little trickier. It comes and goes. It sort of pops out when society needs it. It exists for periods of time, but he called it the way of the sly man, right? It's for people who are trying to balance the other three functions, trying to get a more harmonized human experience, and who have a kind of metacognitive flexibility,
Okay.
right? They're able to
What was that
play
word
with
again?
narratives and symbols.
Could you repeat that
Sly?
word? Yeah.
Which one? Yeah, the Sly Man.
Sly Man? Could you spell that?
Sly Man, the Sly Man.
Oh, Sly
S-L-Y-M-A-N,
Man.
the
Oh,
Sly Man.
okay.
Yeah,
Right,
it's a
right,
kind
right.
of
Okay.
like the
That's right. I remember.
intelligence
Okay.
that's often ascribed
Right.
to
Mhm.
Odysseus.
Gotcha.
Right, like there's
Yes.
cunning there, like
Okay.
MacGyver, kind of
Right.
a person who can play with concepts and not be bound by them.
Lovely.
So if you have that sensibility and you're interested in doing physical, emotional, and mental work to create a harmonized self, then you might be drawn to this other, more complex, more periodic approach to spirituality, which has become known as the Fourth Way,
Gotcha.
largely because of Ouspensky's book called The Fourth Way.
Right.
So we'll put that aside and look at these systems a little bit, because I think one way for us to get into this conversation is the notion of, I want to call it HGI. So we're always talking about AI, and is AI going to become AGI? Is it going to become artificial general intelligence? Is that already happening? Right? And so I think one of the insecurities around this popular discussion is we're aware that we're not quite as conscious as we would like to be, right? That we pride ourselves on being, I have a self, I have a consciousness, here I am, I'm a human being.
Right.
But really, a lot of our thinking is like the autocomplete on a phone, right? You set something up and the next thing just slots in. And if you could look there, you wouldn't be surprised by what's coming up if you knew the database that was being drawn upon.
Totally.
So most of our thinking, most of our actions, most of our responses are kind of biomechanoid, kind of like an automaton.
Yep.
And we need to be, and I think this is a good way to think about Gurdjieff's teaching, trying to figure out what efforts we would have to make to achieve HGI, human general intelligence. Right? What are the internal systems that would have to be exercised and interlinked? What kind of critical stance would we have to take to our own automated responses? What kind of skepticism would we have to have toward the idea that we already have all the functional parts of a human being? All that kind of stuff. So I think one way to think about this is he's trying to set up an educational ethos to produce HGI, which is probably pretty convergent with what you're calling Mind 4 and like a Mind 4 civilization.
Totally.
And like, what's the and right now this is serious, because what's the HGI we need to handle AGI as it emerges? Because from, I think, your perspective, those are both parts of this joint point that's occurring now.
100%. So, right. Just, so we jumped out of the minded animal layer with our justificatory structures. That gives our capital C culture. Folks know this. And then there's also the emerging technological layer. But what's actually happening in the fifth joint point is the information interface and the explosion of this digital global. And then what is the wisdom stack that we need to engage in, and what's the map of that? And the argument is that certainly natural science isn't giving us an adequate map because it breaks down in psychology, cognitive science, and the social sciences. We can create that map. And indeed, you can see it in Gurdjieff, certainly. So we translate that. Okay, so I have a physical body at a matter level, and that would stay in place when I die. Then I'm a living organism that's embodied in a particular way. And then there's the basic structure of the sensory motor loop. So that's all mind one. So that's embodied physical mind one stuff. And if you go out and be an athlete and you create that, that's a minded structure. Then within that is the second mind two looping structure, which is so guided by affect and imagery. Right? And the primate self of, say, love and connection, if that's where we're going to be, and how to embody that, that'd be then mind two is essentially the emotional versus the body layer. And then mind intellect, the justifying, thinking, analyzing, mind three structure. So we can now just slightly translate mind 1, 2, 3. And then what is the actual interaction? The integration of that within and between and in the context that we're in, so that we can actually get conscious, right, of where we are and the decisions, and are we being herd animals toward particular primitive structures that are reacting because it's got a disintegrated, defensive, fragile structure that's then compensating in a particular way, or actually we coherently integrated, know where we are, know where we want to go, and are at least able to then navigate the incredible changes that are coming and at least nudge us towards a more adaptive outcome. I mean, that's UTOK. And when I was reading this, that's Gurdjieff, right? In many ways. I mean, there's a lot of overlap with that.
Yeah, as I was thinking about this discussion, one of the things that struck me is, the person that you are who receives a dharma of some kind, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's roughly your mind 3A,
Yep.
right? That's
Totally.
who receives it. And so that mind is where the path to awakening, let's call it, starts,
Yep.
right? And so the first thing it has to do is differentiate itself from the other systems, right? It's got to make sure that it's not getting confused with mind 3B, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's authentic to you? How do you
Totally.
demarcate the difference between the social narratives you've taken on board versus your actual justifications for things?
Totally.
And then how do you start taking those other systems into account, folding them into mind 3A's justificatory narrative about what it is? And then, and this is particularly important in Gurdjieff and perhaps understressed in a lot of contemporary and postmodern spirituality, you have to struggle, you have to fight, you have to experience remorse, you have to turn both your behavioral modalities and your narrative modalities against each other to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And that this ability to play them off each other, whether you're trying to synchronize them or just make them fight and profit from that, that's a lot of the provides the energy out of which the mind for metacognitive self starts to emerge. It's not merely I witness everything that's arising. I also have
Right.
to get into the game of playing different behavioral and justificatory modes off against each other to become the more integrated, more meta version of what I can be.
Is this one of the errors then he would say Buddhists make? Is this then related to that? Because you talked about, you mentioned this, like, well, okay, there's suffering and we're going to position ourselves in relationships, so let resistance go. Is that fair in terms of that? That's where you point to sort of some of the errors that Buddhism would make in terms of the nature of trauma and suffering? Or am I misreading that?
I think that's close. I mean, Gurdjieff has this great phrase in the Beelzebub's Tale, super novel that he writes, which is our inner evil god self-calming. So that we're even if we want to be transformational beings, we want to continue to grow and learn, we let ourselves off the hook a lot. And we let
Mm,
ourselves off the hook in terms of the intensities that we would experience by allowing different aspects, different perspectives, different modalities to struggle with each other. And he
mm,
does have he has a critique of all the traditional wisdom teachings. And he said they're all great. These were true and amazing teachers, but we fucked up their teachings immediately because of the way that we are and the way we receive those teachings.
mm, mm-hmm.
And in the Buddhist critique, and in the historical myth that he's building around that critique, one of the main things he says is they took struggle to suppress their vital energies, right?
Mm-hmm.
Let's not eat, let's not sleep, let's not
Right.
have sex. Let's be really intense, isolated, ascetic conquerors of ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And he's saying, well, that's interesting, but that fits pretty neatly into your justification models. You can, right, rather than allowing them to struggle with each other. And if you
Mm-hmm.
really want to have your drives or
Mm-hmm.
your behavioral modality, your justified behavioral modalities struggle with each other, the best place to do that is in your relationships with other people,
Right.
right? That you're, right, you have
The
this
interpersonal
cauldron
friction,
of
right? Mm-hmm.
exactly interpersonal friction. Anybody in a relationship knows this. Anybody who's ridden the bus knows this, right? There's energy there between you and other people that you have to deal with.
That's
And
right.
you let yourself off the hook by
Mm.
isolating yourself in an ascetic chamber for personalized, almost solipsistic self struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So
Mm-hmm.
that's one of his critiques of the Buddhist
Gotcha.
approach, is that we fantasize that by escaping from the difficulties of interpersonal interaction, we can then
Fascinating.
work on ourselves. But the place that work is automatically trying to happen
That's
is
interesting.
in that
Mm-hmm.
interpersonal friction.
Right. Awesome. And then that affords growth, in essence, that tension. And so sort of like a stress, a challenge, and then a reorganization. That would Gurdjieff then say that's sort of an opportunity for increasing growth and awareness through that struggle, and maybe even a complexification process between order and chaos, things along those lines.
Absolutely. Like Thich Nhat Hanh used this phrase interbeing, and he used it
Mm-hmm.
kind of like cosmic universalist sense. But I think in Gurdjieff, you get this sense that you're developing an interbeing between the different facets of your existing being, right? And the way you do that is by taking the friction you have with other people or with internal disagreements you have with yourself,
Right.
taking that on board, making it be something that you own, that you identify with, and occupying the space that cognitive dissonance usually pushes us out of, right?
Right.
Being the one who stands between these two elements. And I think a lot of our like Gurdjieff has these different ideas about suffering, right? A lot of suffering is stupid. You just stop doing it. But then there's the suffering you could lean into. And the
Yep.
suffering you could lean into is that wherever you feel these typical angsts that we all go through, and when as you age, you're like, oh yeah, I've been through this shit before. Why am I still
Hmm.
struggling with this?
Hmm.
He would say that underneath there's kind of a polarization. There's two different justified behavior modes struggling with each other. And if you can clarify the struggle and occupy the middle space and say, listen, I agree with both of you, let's fight this out.
Hmm.
And the fighting it out generates the energy, but it also neurons that fire together wire together kind of thinking.
Right. Yep.
They're more in contact through
Mm.
you when you occupy
Hmm.
that interspace, and it allows that the being that you could be between your modes to start
Hmm.
to arise, which I think is
Fascinating.
essential to the Mind 4 production.
Totally. So lots of cool associations there. Does he do? That's got a little Hegelian flavor to it. It seems. On the one hand, I don't know if he's informed by that. I'm also reminded, and he wouldn't be informed by it, but an internal family systems kind of view in relationship to a self structure that's got these particular types of modes that need to be listened to and acknowledged. And then the last thing I'll say is absolutely. I'm going to be a little announcement here. My friend Baron Short, who's a psychiatrist who is really interested and integral into UTOK, and built a whole sort of. He had an integrated mindfulness approach, and then he's blended that into what he called UTIC, Unified Theory in the Knower, and create a path. And then we're going to explore after Mind 1, 2, 3, what does Mind 4 look like? And essentially, it's this meta recursion around systems, around self, around awareness and attention, and finding yourself between, in a adjacent, relational, metaphysical kind of place between, above, beyond, around all of these different elements, and finding attention, self, awareness within them. So anyway, that we can come back to that, but that's Mind 4. So those are all some of the associations. The Hegelian kind of move, it almost feels like a family systems move, and certainly what I'm looking for is some sort of Mind 4 path, and it sounds like he's a fourth way. He's got a lot of parallels I was noticing that I could draw, and of course, I don't think like he does, because I'm like much more concrete in some ways, but it was wonderful to kind of see the incredible plurality that he kind of wove together, at least through you. So that was fascinating.
Yeah, I loved hanging out with you and Baron at the Spring Metamodern retreat, and I think there's a lot of future to doing the neurological correlates to all this stuff. But when we look at let's say, the Hegelian and the IFS aspects of this, the Hegelian part, and this is an interesting thing because Gurdjieff overlaps what we might call the North American and the continental European
Yep.
ethos of what's
I got
happening
that
here.
sense, yeah.
And I think one of the reasons is because there is an aspirational developmental path to being a better person. The North Americans love that.
Mm-hmm.
But it's the inclusion of the negativity that the Europeans like so much about it, that Hegelian element. Because for Gurdjieff, absence and negativity are huge roles in operating our higher functions. That you need to lean into your suffering, and you need to be able to generate or take advantage of elements of friction where something is challenging the model, the modality, the self that you're bringing into things. He has this way of talking about it. He says the wholly denying force, which is a beautiful phrase, right? There's the wholly affirming, the wholly denying, and the wholly reconciling.
Lovely.
And, they're very simple in all ways. The wholly affirming is what you're trying to do, and the wholly denying is whatever's fucking that up, right? But we usually regard that as a problem to get rid of. And he's like, no, this is your opportunity. If it wasn't there, you would have to create it, because you don't want to get trapped just in the justified self-narrative that you've got right now that never grows beyond what it is. You want to be able to enfold every other aspect of yourself, and some other aspect of yourself is showing up in the way you respond to your thwartedness, right?
That's
So
awesome.
there's a beautiful way of.
I'll jump in right here. So this is a mug Marcia gave me. That's Void Darkness Day. It doesn't show up super well, and then it's -1 + 1 = 0 for Monday. So Monday's Void Darkness Day. It's our I fast, don't have sex, get bitter, realize that negative events happen. I believe in the void, darkness, and negative events, and then it starts with negative, and then dialectically related to the positive to achieve a dialectical transformative balance. So the blackness is definitely in UTOK. It starts the week. So I like that connection for sure.
I love it because we're, the North American models, let's say typified by Ken Wilber, are very much like, hey, we get that whole thing about synthesis, but it's at a very clean, very sterile, very intellectual level of building a more complicated model, not at the level of, this is fucking upsetting me and disturbing everything I'm trying to do right now. Is there any way I can make that useful to my growth?
Totally.
Right. So I think that's the kind of Hegelian element in Gurdjieff, is that you anticipate, prepare for, and utilize the negative as a necessary function of producing the motor of your own growth.
Totally.
The IFS part.
Clinically, I would sometimes ask, I'll just put right on that. Clinically, how depressed do you want to be? Or how enraged do you want to be? I would often ask that. That throws people off. Like, what are you talking about? It's a negative emotion. I don't want it to. Actually, part of you does. Right? And probably for good reason. Let's sort out the adaptive and maladaptive aspects of that. But almost always they're adaptive. People are, oh, it's just bad. It's like, no, definitely not. So anyway, I love that aspect.
Well, your notion of the triple negative neurotic loop, I think, is a really nice, tidy phrasing. But that, the third negation there is the problematic element. It's negating the negation in the wrong way, right? It's trying to not experience the negation. So the first thing you have to do on your journey of healing or growth is allow yourself to actually experience the negation that's going on. You're like, oh, this is really upsetting. I hate this.
Right. And that's okay, right? And indeed, that's part of growth and engagement, real engagement with the world. If you block that, you're going to alienate a huge part of yourself. And then all of a sudden, the positive and negative. I mean, I'm always like, part of I fast on Monday, wake up on Tuesday. Oh, I get to eat today. How glorious is that? You get to have sex today. Hey, that's a big difference, right? In a positive way. And it is that contrast that brings so much alive and is necessary to explore the edges. So anyway, I interrupted you. I think you were going to say something about IFS.
Oh, yeah. Just touch on the internal family systems thing, because this is one, I call Gurdjieff the grandfather of metamodern spirituality. I could just as easily have called him the grandfather of pluralistic psychology, right? So we're in a moment now where it's coming into its own, where there's your symphony of selves, and there's a notion that to have an inner community of parts is not a sign of a schizoid dysfunction, but is in fact the normal condition of beings.
Yep.
And that what we used to think of as a single unified being is either a pathological distortion or just the name for good teamwork between these parts.
Love it.
Right.
Yep.
And I think Gurdjieff starts to bring that in. Now, there's Saglioli and a couple other guys in the early 20th century that start to do this. And arguably Nietzsche was making a similar argument in 1870. But Gurdjieff really says, if you want to do self-unfolding, you want to do spiritual or existential development, you're going to have to deal with the fact that you are not a singularity. You're a plurality. Right? You've got to first start to figure out what are the different subjectivized parts of you, right? There's a lot of different voices in there, and they can all say I. They can all claim to be the me, right? They can all grab the microphone and for a minute or an hour think they're the one in charge, and then they leave and somebody else has to deal with the cleanup.
Totally.
So this notion of how do you create a healthy internal community in order to actually move the human being to its next level as the fundamental aspect of spirituality? I think that's a very contemporary idea. It's been emerging through the 20th century. It's getting stabilized now, but it's not the way we talked about spiritual development historically. We historically said, I'm a single individual, and my individuality was given to me by the great individual, and I'm already perfectly fixed, and when I die, my perfectly fixed individuality will go somewhere else and enjoy a reward or a damnation, right? So Gurdjieff is insisting that our growth framing is the framing of a plurality, and that it takes the interactions of various kinds into account.
I love that. And in fact, I mentioned this in a blog, warning a little mature content, but we don't need to, hopefully not panic. But one of my early blogs that I wrote spoke to this as I was, becoming a psychologist, and basically was handed, oh, you're this self, and a healthy cognitive behavioral self knows what it is and makes all these choices and blah, blah, blah. But I realized that as an undergrad, my then wife, or not wife at the time, but long-term girlfriend, went to a different college. I got exposed to feminism and worried about pornography and objectification of women, and developed a justification that said, hey, we would really be cautious about that, and I wouldn't do that. But I watched myself over time relative to my own connections, and realized that sometimes my justification for pornography was really like, oh yeah, that's bad, depending on what mode I was in at the level of libidinal energy. And then other times, well, it's not really that bad. You can blah, 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 right? And anyone out there, right, can almost certainly acknowledge that there are different modes of embodiment that give rise to different justifications in different contexts, right? And the idea that there is a single one is grossly, I think. And then the question really was like, well, what teaches? The psychodynamic model teaches this, but the cognitive and behavioral models, certainly a standard CBT model really doesn't. It gives you this sort of like, oh, this is the right way to think. It doesn't help you see these dynamic structures in a particular kind of way. And that always fascinated me. What's the right model for a dynamic system that is going through different waves, modes, and has different needs at different times? How do you hold that plurality in a coherent integration? Was an early question. So that sounds very parallel.
Yeah, it's a profound question, and I think it's going to reformat basically all of our thinking about psychology and spirituality going forward as we unfold into network civilization, because I think the network model lends itself to a plurality notion of the psyche. And I think we're moving into a phase where we're going to have to really take seriously something that our ancestors either ignored or attributed to supernatural powers, which is non-conscious intelligences of various kinds. And by non-conscious, I mean not the waking state, left brain, human, socially informed personality.
Right.
So what are the alternatives to that? Well, there's your subconscious intelligence in all of its variations. Mm-hmm. There's artificial intelligences we're producing at a rapid rate, and there's collective intelligences, right? And there may be more beyond that, but at least those three need to be taken into account as we form this new civilization. And I think particularly when it comes to how do we work well with collectives, how do we generate an intersubjective and interobjective intelligence, a collective sapience, you have to have a good kind of clean arrangement of your internal community so that you can be a participant in the emerging external community. So like getting those lined up is going to be a big issue for us going forward. And a lot of the Gurdjieffian practices, but under that, this basic assumption that you are a plurality, I think those could be really helpful to us.
That's fascinating. I did and I know he's been on with John some. So John Stewart, of the complexity evolutionary biologist, guy who just emphasizes the process of complexification, which basically there's a dialectical tension between competition and cooperation, and then some metastable pattern needs to happen where there's right-ordered cooperative structure of differentiation and integration. And there are certain contexts that enable that to happen, and other situations, both within the entities and between them, that break it all down and rip it apart. And that is, I think that's a very accurate basic model. And what that means is we better be well attuned to our fractal plurality within us, to situate ourselves to know how to cooperate at the higher order digital global. That's one way of describing the challenge that we're in. We're either going to get to that stable or we're going to break it. Basically, that once it reaches this level, it's either going to stabilize, or God only knows what that look like, but either basically create a metastable pattern that has enough checks and balances that affords cooperation. And then the question is, what kind of psychic, social, individual, into societal, into technological, relative to Mother Earth structures that are going to afford that kind of stabilization? That's essentially the fifth joint point question. And so here you have Gurdjieff pointing clearly to this basic structure and dynamic and ways in which we might awaken ourselves to it, practices that we might engender, a plurality across all these. I noticed that he jumped around a lot of different cultures, was in Russia for a while, moved into all sorts of different kinds of, I was very impressed with the wide variety of experiences that he embraced.
And I would note that competition cooperation is an interesting alternative phrasing for wholly affirming and wholly denying, right? That a lot of his he at one point he breaks down his whole approach and he says he's going to call it being dog duty, and he's always inventing new words. And he says my approach consists of conscious labor and intentional suffering. Now you could say that conscious labor is the attempt to harmonize or generate cooperation between your different parts, and intentional suffering is the attempt to bear the destabilizing but also complexifying tension between your parts.
Totally.
And both of those would be necessary in like a Prigozhin-like emergence at the edge of chaos. But yes, he's a very human character. He knows a lot of languages. He knows a lot of types of people. He's been in a lot of cultures, and he's seen a lot of the things that we probably couldn't see anymore, right? Like in 1890, you could just blunder into the Great Pyramid in a way you can't right now. So this is a guy who sometimes he's described as Russian, and I think because he's Greek Armenian, you always kind of want to correct that a little bit. But he grew up in Armenia with a Greek father. It was sort of under the influence of the Russian Empire to some degree at that time. He began at a very early age making forays to see monasteries, temples, archaeological remains, that kind of thing. Spent a lot of time in Egypt, spent a lot of time in Tibet, spent a little time further east, India and China. Spent a lot of time exploring the Middle East, the sort of between the Middle East and India area where a lot of the spiritual traditions of humanity go back to that area, and it's the way it intersects with the Silk Road. But because Russia was so expansive at that time, he spent some time as a kind of espionage agent for the Russians and ended up moving to Russia thinking it was the great civilization. And when he felt he was ready to bring his teaching and his being to people, that's where he went, was to Moscow and St. Petersburg, where he encountered Ouspensky and this cabal of really elite practitioners, which is an interesting feature because there are teachers who just welcome any spiritual rogue off the streets, and that's a nice approach. But Gurdjieff wanted people who had high autonomy, high capacity already to start working on this stuff. Unfortunately, Russian Revolution, Second World War destroys everything he's trying to do. So he and his students are on the run from world chaos. And they flee into the Caucasus Mountains, and they end up trying to set something up in Germany. They finally set something up in France. And then there's a parallel center in England. The war ends, but of course another war is coming not too far down the road. And they end up sort of being very Western. Even though a lot of them are coming out of this deep Eastern context, the work really proceeds in England, France, and then the United States as the primary areas because those are the dominant powers, and that's where the civilization stability ends up being in the mid-20th century.
Yeah, can you say a little bit? You make a very. I noticed at one point they said, "Here's his first." I think maybe it was on Wiki. Maybe you mentioned this. Here's his first pupil. Here's his second. He maybe has a total of 30 pupils. His approach to mentorship looked very intense, deliberate. Like, what would it be to become a pupil of Gurdjieff? What would that mean? Can you say a little bit about? I was curious as to if I don't know how standardized it was. It seemed like it was intense. Like, okay, that's a big thing. If I'm going to take on this guy's teachings, maybe I misread that.
It's very interesting because he's more intense than some teachers, but he also insists on your autonomy more than a lot of teachers do. So at first, there's this couple of clubs he sets up in Russia. Okay. And his initial idea was that I could draw people out of existing esoteric societies. Let me get the people who are into theosophy and anthroposophy and things like that. But he also started to feel that that was a limited sample of the human species, and that he needed to range a little bit more broadly and get artists and mathematicians and people like that who were accomplished in other domains of life. His initial approach seems to be very casual, right? Okay. If you're not coming on board explicitly as his student, then you can just have conversations with him, get provoked by his ideas, kind of bask in his presence to some degree. But if you really want to get involved, then he's going to start applying pressure and disturbance to you in certain ways. Now, that conforms to his theory. Might also be some personal pathology there, like who knows? But he really felt like it was a comfortable thing for him to put the screws to people and see what they did.
Gotcha.
And so he would generate stresses and crises. He would give people tasks. There were dances, right? Later in his life, he was listed on his French passport as a teacher of dancing because he would create and also replicate sacred temple dances he'd seen in monasteries in the East. And you never know how much is recollection and how much is invention.
Right.
He produced music, he produced writing, but there was a lot of training in these dances and these sort of complicated heart, mind, and body ballet moves with symbolic efficacy where he had to work in a coordinated way with others. However, I would say that he was idiosyncratic and he was a believer in the idiosyncratic. That what was peculiar to him was not necessarily something you had to replicate. You had to become equally peculiar. And he gave different teachings to each person because he regarded people as being of different subtypes or of different sort of traumas. They had different things they needed to fix.
Right.
Or he just wanted them to flourish as the remarkable rare beings that they were. So one of the complaints he has about standard spiritual teaching is like TM. Here's the TM technique. Now, I use TM. It's a great technique. But the idea that it's homogeneously for everyone at all times, he would have balked at that idea, right? Everything you undertake is temporary, and it's for you specifically, and the person next to you who heard it should not necessarily be undertaking that same developmental technique.
Gotcha. So that sounds, one-many dialectic is pretty profound, and it sounds like he appreciates that in the context of human subjectivity and multiplicity in terms of in the ideographic. The other thing I want to make sure I ask, I want to get your take both about what it was like writing the book, what you had the opportunity, and but when we're staying in Gurdjieff, let's go to some of the negative. I mean, is he a charlatan? Is he kind of is he super weird? What do you see if you take a lens of critique? What do you see are potential legitimate critiques, or just recount some of the critiques that other people maybe offered of him?
I mean, there are some standard critiques. One critique is there's a lot of people today who just don't like any male authority, especially if it's a male spiritual authority, right? That's already problematic to a lot of people. I don't mind that. I've spent a lot of time with those people. There's this notion that he was a charlatan, and I think that's belied by the reports of the people who've spent the most time with him, and the fact that those people are not, like I was saying, street reject, gullible, naive spiritual seekers. They're already people of high intellectual and social accomplishment, right? So that I put a lot of faith in their evaluations of him, and the people who spent the most time with him have a pretty intense appreciation for how remarkable he was. And there's also this story that he killed Catherine Mansfield, which was sort of hyperbole in the newspaper at the time, but there's a famous writer who went to stay with him, and she was very enthusiastic, but she died of, I think, tuberculosis on the property. But in the French tabloids, it was, crazy forest cult leader kills famous woman. So all of that I can largely dismiss. The places I take critique seriously are, I think he was so rooted in the patriarchal attitudes of the mid-19th century that even though he continued to evolve and be avant-garde and was able to contradict himself, that there's still a lot of that spirit there, that he doesn't do the feminine full service. I think that he enjoyed manipulating and distressing people a little more than was necessary for their spiritual development, which makes a fun character, but an unpleasant personal experience. And everybody's got to draw that line in terms of standing up to your teacher, right? That's a big question for anybody with a mentor. I really enjoy the fact he would have huge emotional expressions, right? He would scream and yell and, do this drama, which I'm not like that, and I really don't appreciate being around people like that. But I can see that it's a beautiful thing as play, and I don't think there's any reason why the awakened temperament should confine itself to this endlessly moderate benevolence. You should be able to play the full range of human intensity. So I respect that, but I think he Here's another thing: is he was deeply trained in what we would now call hypnotherapy, and he liked to play with people's subconscious minds.
Okay.
And I think he also liked to play energetically with people. And he was often holding himself back from being too manipulative. But I think under certain conditions, he didn't hold himself back.
Let that slip through a little more than might be ideal in terms of consequence. Okay. Lovely. That's a very rich. And so now maybe I think these things would be, and certainly I already have a sense, but, kind of what, as you wrote this book, what did you learn about yourself, about him? What was it like as you sort of undertook it? Sort of the prep work, what made you decide? And then as you pulled all these hyper-personal essays together and then related to him, can you share some reflections about how it impacted you and how you saw him in relation?
Sure. I mean, there was a discussion in my room at Sky Meadow one night where Brendan and I decided there should be a Sky Meadow press.
Okay.
And part of it was I was talking about all these like 80% written manuscripts that I have. And he's like, we could write one of those. And so I intended to do that. But when I sat down to write Sky Meadow's first book, this just came on me. I wanted to get this out. I wanted to place it outside of myself, partly because Gurdjieff is probably, other than maybe Nietzsche, the person that other people ask me about the most because they feel I have a peculiar take on it. And I would like all the answers to be in one place. But also, I've gained so much from my experiences with this guy, with his pupils, his lineages, his writings, that I wanted to pay back. Right? And that's a key element of this teaching. But, I work a lot with integration surplus models, right? And they're more complex than just 3 systems. There's a lot of things I'm working on there, but I don't think a lot of my ideas could have become fleshed out in my own experience without my deep reading of his ideas. His actual writings are so strange, and I mean, he has these peculiar ideas about communication, particularly written communication, that I love. But I've just gained so much in terms of my practice, and my ideation from him that I thought I would feel good to promote him, and also to highlight him to a new community, but to let the old Gurdjieffian community know that there's new ways of appreciating him. And I think kind of a renaissance coming. There's a lot of people have experienced him in a new way that people who worked on the Gurdjieff system 50 years ago would be pretty surprised by, I think. And an integration of those forces would be great. It flowed out of me because a lot of these points are the points that I've come to many times in reading or doing the practices or negotiating with people in the Gurdjieff traditions. They're answers that I've given people when they've asked me about my take on Gurdjieff many times. So it was tremendously fun and easy. It just flowed out of me. And what I sit with now is the melange of it. He's a harmonizer. Right. One of the things he loved to do was cook for people. And one aspect of cooking is just taking a bunch of weird ingredients and trying to blend them. And that blended, emergent quality is often the thing that you remember about a person, about a dish, about a practice. That's what I remember about this book. Is I look back at now, and I'm really happy with the way I blended and integrated so many aspects of my personal take on this person. And whether or not I'm talking about objective Gurdjieff or just my Gurdjieff,
right,
the flavor of my relationship to whoever that is so much smoother and richer and more delicious for me now after having done this. I would recommend anybody who loves any teacher try to write a book about them. It's marvelous.
That's beautiful. So as you were saying that, I was kept coming back to this hyper personal. Okay, so I assume that's a play off Morton's hyper object at some level. And I was also kind of associated. So in our transcendent naturalism, as we dialogued about, there's strong transcendence, which we are, I think, all collectively pointing to, sort of like, hey, there's a collective consciousness that's available in a potential hyper object of fifth joint point or whatever, that we can then see what's real, wake up to. So anyway, what I was relating to there is your engagement with him and your awakening him and your gift of love of the book in relationship to that, and what that meant for you and what it meant sort of almost as a transcendent reflection for the rest of us. Like I felt like, oh, I could follow that coherent, integrated, pluralistic vision of humanity that you're embodying as a beacon right now. So that's beautiful. I really appreciate that. That's a lovely way of making that network transcendent, strong transcendent collective vision. I certainly felt that, at least.
Hyper-personal is it's a very meaningful concept to me, and part of it relates to Morton, right, and the way we extend the notion of hyper-objects to hyper-subjects. Part of it for me is kind of a Teilhard de Chardin kind of idea, right? He felt that the noosphere was going to super subjectivize people, right? And you can imagine somebody sitting at home with their computer, customizing everything and becoming a node of idiosyncrasy. And de Chardin felt like the more exquisitely individual you become, the more you become like the emergent Christ. Right, the connector between the noosphere and the omegasphere goes through the hyper individual, not through the alternative, which is the impersonal. Right, I would say that's the opposite of the hyper personal. Okay. And there are a lot of, especially in the axial age, attempts to abnegate the peculiar qualities of the self in order to become available to transcendental functions, and that can work under certain conditions. But I don't think that's the most full spectrum, healthy, generalizable version of transcendence.
Gotcha.
That what we really need are individuals who are supra-individual in a sense, so that they can join together in a supra-collective of some kind. And when I read Gurdjieff, especially the later books, which are, I mean, Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson is a moving cathedral of mythological strangeness and psychotechnological instruction. But the next ones are even stranger in some ways, even more slippery. And you get this sense of him as a very, very individual character. And I hope that in writing this book, I also come across as peculiar in my own way. And that there's something about that is core to Dharma, core to pedagogy, core to transmission, is to be really the stranger that you are. And I've been with a lot of different spiritual teachers, and the ones who I feel like have impacted me the most were the most oddly themselves. And other ones who gave me great teachings, gave me beautiful, energetic experiences, but didn't quite manifest in their full hyper-personal strangeness. I always felt heartbroken that something was missing from that transaction.
Wow. That's beautiful. Yeah, the full realization of the unique particular individual as it manifests in the plurality. I mean, that, and holding that fractal again and again appears, and giving the space for that, and seeing folks who, like Gurdjieff, who can manifest their autonomy, individuality, whatever word, in its fullness, and then also be harmonizing and connecting in the plurality. That's awesome. And I hadn't quite caught the other version of hyper-personal in the impersonal dialectic sense. So that's cool. What's been, the book's been out for a little while. Has any of the Gurdjieff, traditionalists caught it in a particular way? Does it feel like people are going to kind of book clubs about this at all and talking about it? What's been, felt like the reaction?
I've been having a lot of discussions with people about it. It's only been a few months.
Yep.
I get a lot of feedback from people who are like, oh, I always had heard about this guy, and this is a great introduction, and it's an introduction that has a different tone than some of the other introductions to this work. I've got a little bit of reach out for people in more standard Gurdjieff lineages who have said, hey, this is not exactly the way we do it, but we're interested.
Okay. Right.
And a lot of the little probing and testing. And I'm familiar with people in these lineages from decades of interacting with them. I love that. I'm intrigued to see how it unfolds. And I'm intrigued to see the possibility, because these are the people that interest me the most, is other people who want to bring forward a different flavor of their appreciation of Gurdjieff and both his nature and his ideas. So I've been spending a lot of time with Skylar Brown. She co-taught at the Goddess Retreat with me.
Nice.
And she's writing a book because she's been channeling Catherine Mansfield, and she had a Gurdjieffian teacher. Right? And well, that's very interesting because the feminine and the channeled, that's not necessarily a major component of traditional Gurdjieff lineage literature.
Okay.
And I give her as an example of somebody who I think is part of a general movement of people who've been seeing him, reading him, appreciating him, and maybe have had Gurdjieffian mentors, but their context is very different than the context that was there in 1950 or 1980.
Right. Sure.
Right? One of the things I point at is I've listened to Gurdjieff's books on audio hundreds of times, probably, right? I can put them in and I can listen to Life is Real Only Then When I Am, going to the liquor store, going for a hike, mowing the lawn, listen to it over and over. And that's something that a student of his in 1930 never had. Right? That student has something I don't have, of course. But there are a lot of people who've been experiencing it in ways that were not available to the previous couple of generations.
Right.
And I think there's a fun, lively, metamodern adjacent sensibility there that could be the beginning of a renaissance of appreciation of these ideas, especially if the people in the existing traditions can hear that it's authentic and start to blend with it in some way. If the outliers and the lineal
carriers or whatever.
If they can come together and produce something, I think there's a chance that we'll get a really useful evocation of what this guy had to offer and still has to offer, because he's one of those people who is still out ahead of us in many ways, even though we're generations on from his life.
Right. Yeah, no, that's beautiful. And, you know, again, this sort of this capacity to layer, I'm really struck by his layers, I guess, you know, and that now how it might reveal itself in a whole new age that affords these kinds of novel opportunities to relate to it then in novel technologies. And he does feel like he's placed himself at the right kind of frequency for what it is that we're facing. So that jumped out at me and made clear in this conversation, has brought it home. Is there anything that we didn't cover in the book that you'd like folks to take home or consider or sort of summarize or anything along those lines? Or sort of wrap up the summary of the book?
Yeah, I think the role of the subconscious is really underappreciated in most of the people who approach his work. And I come at that from two directions. One is he was an avant-garde artist in Paris in the 1920s, right? A lot of his students were the people who first published James Joyce or that kind of thing. The surrealists were active. So this ability to think that the integration of conscious and unconscious sense-making styles might elicit a hyper-reality, a surrealité. I think he was not fundamentally apart from that avant-garde ethos. I think he was an uninspected driver and participant of that sense that we need to become, like John says, virtuosos of the imaginal. Right? And that involves harvesting the subconscious pattern-making styles in interesting ways. And he also says, even though there's this emphasis on consciousness and waking up and conscious labor, a lot of times he'll say, the problem with you people, human beings, is that what you call the subconscious is what I call your real consciousness. Right? And that even though you can walk around and talk and drive cars and you can pick up the Buddha or Christ or something and read it and say, yes, I agree with that. I accept that justification. I'm going to try to act on that. He's like, oddly, you don't really act on it. You don't really embody it. It's because your conscious mind is catching the information and it really needs to go through your subconscious to become part of your overall being. And this notion that the development is largely a development of something that we currently keep in the subconscious, that has the instincts, the drivers, the machinery in it that would actually change us. And that if you wanted to help people, you'd have to, like a good hypnotherapist, bypass their conscious mind in order to talk to them somehow. That's a huge part of him that I think there's still a future in figuring out how to appreciate that.
That's awesome. And that relates, I mean, if we go back to at least a simplistic notion of the three minds or whatever, the coherent integration across the stack and realizing this danger of propositional bypass at multiple levels is a real problem, I think, for modernity, both in its organization and its affordance technologically, analytically, etc., to abstract and then create worlds and then manifest themselves that are completely, alien, disconnected. Whereas what we really want to be doing is we want to think about ourselves as energy, matter, life, mind, culture from the bottom as well as the top. That's the context in which all this, and that's the line of coherent integration. And if we fail to do that, I think the dangers are so much more obvious than if we're actually achieving that. So his attention to that resonates with me in that regard.
Yeah, he's got a Jill Nephew, who's in our circles.
Of course.
She once referred to Beelzebub's Tales as a compendium of the failure modes of psychotechnologies, which is a beautiful phrase. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that book does is it goes through, because the devil who lives on Mars keeps coming down to Earth and seeing all the different things that go wrong and the attempts to correct it with developmental and educational ethos. And he constantly says, the human beings aren't set up to hear truths. You can tell them the truth and it'll go to the wrong part of them and it won't become who they are, right? It's not enough to be, people would say to him, should I become a Christian? He would say, well, can you? Right? It's not like, what are you going to do? Just decide to say that you are one now?
Right.
Like, are you actually capable of being a Buddhist, of being a Christian, of being a Muslim, of being an atheist? Is that something of which you are actually capable? Can your embodied, subjective, inactive being do that? Or are you just going to say it and tell yourself that you believe in it? And it changes the notion of pedagogy, right? Which is normally pedagogy is, I say something and it goes into your conscious waking brain and you store it and duplicate it and say it back, and then I sign off on the piece of paper that you did that.
Totally.
But I think his notion, which to me is a more prehistoric kind of archaic shamanic notion, is that I have a certain understanding, and that by saying something to you, I trigger you to develop a strange understanding of your own that is analogous to mine, but doesn't necessarily have the same content. And in this manner, we create a pedagogy of understanding, not just a pedagogy of knowing. And that's essential for general existential development, but especially for the creation of a mind for civilization on this planet.
Right. And one that's coherently integrated across the stack, because that's all of this propositional stuff, while it can be abstracted, ultimately it's embodied and embedded, and the way it's going to manifest itself is in relation. So sweet. That's beautiful. Yeah, no, I mean, that is, and if you're, one of the things that I was doing with the garden as an educational thing is that I always embedded enormous amount of the propositional knowledge, but the idea was that you would start like at a kindergarten, and that you'd be basically, the kindergarten would be a garden where people would live in the world, and then that world would unfold itself propositionally as you grew through the different developmentals. But all that proposition is then nested in your organism, in your material, organismic, animalistic, then culture, person, self. So the notion of consistently nesting a coordinated leveling structure, and the argument that modern civilization and pedagogy, and of course this is an E.M. McGilchrist kind of argument as well, is like we've disconnected and fractured big aspects of our systems that way.
There is so much more we could say about this, but this is probably enough for now, and very happy to talk to you, and also looking forward to your volume from Sky Meadow.
Hey man, yep, that's coming out in the distant future. This was a hell of a run. And I'm one of those people who's like, who is that guy? I hear his name, and then this was a super cool opportunity to then find my connection to you as a fellow Metamodern brother, who then finds this as a hyper-personal object relation that I find to be endearing and potentially strongly transcendent. So thank you very much, friend. Deeply appreciate it.